Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Deployed. Thanks again for tuning in. For those of you who don't know me, I am Michael Kearse. I'm a real estate investor and co-founder of Ameripath USA. Over the last several years, I've helped plenty of investors deploy millions into affordable real estate that creates consistent, secure returns while helping families across the country achieve home ownership. I created Deploy because I realize everyone has capital, whether it be money, knowledge, or relationships, but few deploy it intentionally. So this show is about how the art and science of deployment and how high performers turn their potential into power. My guest today is Pat Roth. I'm super excited about him. He is a brain and spine surgeon, and he's also the author of 4 incredible books. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Before I do that, hey, Pat, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Really looking forward to it.
Awesome, awesome. So my first question for you, Pat, is how do you explain what you do to people who probably don't know you or don't know about you?
Look, the people have all sorts of preconceived notions about surgery, but what I do is like any other skilled laborer, spend a lot of time practicing it. And I guess the stakes are a little bit higher, but earlier in my career, I did a whole spectrum of neurosurgery, which included brain. As my career evolved, at some point I asked myself, what do you like and what are you good at? And decided to sort of pivot into more of spine surgery. And that's really my great interest. We sometimes say in neurosurgery that the men are separated from the boys when they're in the brain in terms of their technical prowess. But in the spine, it's more about decision making and trying to find the right solution for a particular patient's predicament.
Very interesting, very interesting. Now I know with today's advancement in technology, and, and things like that, are you more using your actual hands when you're doing some of your surgery, or are you more controlling robots in this day and age?
It's, we never used our hands. We always, because the brain and the spine are so delicate, we always work with our fingertips holding instruments. It's the tip of the instruments to do the work. Of course, our hands ultimately do the work. And there are robots that help us. For example, when we have to put screws in, they can be done very, very accurately through a robot. But really what we use is global navigation systems. So what's interesting about the brain and the spine is that it sort of has a fixed relationship to the skull and the spinal canal. So if you can tell a computer where the skull is in three-dimensional space, you can figure out where everything in the brain or everything in the spine is relative to that.
Wow.
And so a lot of times we use these instruments at our fingertips while we're looking through a microscope, but we have at our disposal a virtual image based on, a previous MRI. So it can kind of help direct us and navigate us, not unlike a navigation system in a car, just
Right.
more precise.
Interesting, interesting. Now, did you always know that you wanted to be in this field? Because, it's very demanding and obviously the schooling that you have to go through. Or was it something that you gradually kind of decided into at like during your early scholar years?
I would say definitely something that I gradually came to appreciate or desire. My father was a neurologist, which is similar. It's not a surgeon, but he studied the brain and took care of people with brain disorders. And I looked at his life and his career and thought it would be a great thing to do. He was his own boss and he would come home and you could just tell how much he enjoyed things because he would tell us stories at the dinner table. Also, he had the opportunity to be an entrepreneur, which was attractive as well. So I went into medical school thinking that I would follow my father's footsteps and become a neurologist. But when I did my rotations in neurology, I was shocked to find that it was a little bit too impotent for me, meaning you would have these fascinating cases and the diagnosis was fascinating. But when it came time to the treatment part, there wasn't much to offer people. Most of the stuff that neurologists deal with are degenerative or certainly things that have no treatments, although it's gotten better. But when I went in, we're talking 38 years ago now. So I kind of, when I did my surgery rotation, I said, wow, I love this. It's actionable. I can see a problem and maybe go out and fix it. And so I just kind of came to neurosurgery by combining what I really kind of admired about surgery with what I admired about the brain. It seemed preposterous at first. I had never even considered it before. And it's a very long and difficult training.
I bet.
But looking back, it went by really quickly. It was fun, and I have no regrets.
Well, that's awesome. That's awesome. And you mentioned the entrepreneurial aspect, which I think is pretty cool too. So do you get to enjoy that? Have you kind of intertwined that into your career and you really look at it from an entrepreneur's perspective as well?
Definitely, hopefully my final act hasn't come yet because I have some entrepreneurial ideas going forward. But like, for example, my father, at one point, I think it was the in the 70s, CAT scan was invented. And my dad said, we got to get a CAT scan machine. It's going to be the future of neurology. And his partners all said, we did a cost analysis. It can't make money. Even if you run it 24/7, you're not going to make money off it. And my father's like, I don't care. It's the future of neurology. We're going to buy it. And
Yeah.
of course, ultimately it made money. And what I learned from him, and I've learned ever since, if you spend money on what is truly value,
Mm.
it will make money at some point. Not that that's necessarily your goal, but
Hmm.
if you figure out what's valuable,
Hmm.
oh, that's really half the battle. And so don't be afraid to go for it once you believe something has value.
I love that. I love that. So for me, I really tried to, change my financial situation maybe 10 years ago is when I started on my journey. And one of the things that I realized or read or seen somewhere that they said that the individuals who, either are wealthy, stay wealthy, or achieve wealth, they focus on buying assets. So to your point, that really hit home for me, right? It's about, how to grow your finances. And it's, stop focusing on buying doodads or things that don't really appreciate. And if you focus on buying assets, to your point, like focusing on value, you'll see the return eventually. So I love that. And thanks for sharing that. So, switching gears a little bit, I want to go back for a second before all the wins, who you were before the version of success that showed up. What was some of the early struggles that may have shaped you and how you operate today?
Well, I think couples, first of all, before medical school, I was an ambitious athlete, I would say, but obviously I didn't have the talent to necessarily make a career out of it. But
What sport, real quick? What sport?
I played a whole bunch in college. I played basketball and tennis, but in high school, I played football and I wrestled and I played baseball, believe it or not, and then switched to tennis. But the sport that I kind of excelled at mostly was tennis. And I competed as an amateur in tennis. And strangely enough, I had the physical tools, but not the mental tools. I mean, there's so much of tennis is being able to go for it when the going gets tough. You can't play it safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
The competition is too great. And I didn't have that instinct. I gave up that career. And then interestingly enough, when I switched to becoming a surgeon, I just assumed that athletic ability translated to surgical ability. That's just not the case. To me, surgery is more like arts and crafts than it is like sports.
Mm.
And when I got into surgery, I realized, something, I sucked at arts and crafts. And so, what's so interesting to me looking back was not even for a millisecond did I hesitate. My attitude was, okay, this is not necessarily my wheelhouse. I'm going to have to work really hard at getting good. And that's what I did. And I've found throughout my whole career that if you approach things with humility and a growth mindset,
Mm.
you're willing to fail to a certain extent. You're willing to consider after each procedure you do how you could have been better. You just keep improving slowly and steadily. And so whatever natural gifts you may or may not have is dwarfed by the attitude you have towards learning and getting better. And so I think
Absolutely.
that's the major hardship that I overcame.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Was there a big break or deal that kind of helped you get over the hump?
I don't think so. I just think that I'm really a delayed gratification type of guy. So I just, no matter what I've taken on, I've just said, something, I'm not going to be impatient with myself. I'm going to make small steps and expect at the end that I'll end up being where I want. And, it's very much the same as I know you talk a lot about assets and wealth and capital on your show. It's the same thing. I don't know if you've read the book, Atomic Habits.
I have had some of the
Yeah.
snippets. Yeah.
When I read that book, I saw a lot of myself in it. It's one of my favorite books of all time, but I really believe in this idea of doing small atomic habits each day and then watching the power of compound interest so that if you look at your own assets at a few months, you don't see any change. If you look at them at 10 or 20 years, you see unimaginable changes. It's really quite an incredible phenomenon. And that applies to so many things, not just money, of course. It applies to good gestures, health habits, eating habits, sleep habits, etc.
You're 100% right. I've been coaching some students on real estate investing. And one of the things that I shared with them is that I am aware that a lot of the results that I have now is from things that I did 5, 6, 7 years ago, whether it be courses that I've invested in that I probably didn't get the fruits from it right then and there, or the books that I was reading, 5 and 6 years ago when I was trying to get ahead. So you hit the nail in the coffin. I love that. I love that. See, I knew you would be perfect for this podcast. So thanks for joining. So you've built something incredible, right? But I know success is more mindset, like you just mentioned, than mechanics. I want to unpack some more about how you think. Are there any other principles or beliefs that guide how you make decisions?
I think that ultimately I have a bunch of values and they stay with me because I'm a big believer in pivoting in life and changing and growing. But I think you have to keep your values with you. One of the most important values to me is fairness. And I look at a lot of decisions based on just fairness. And so, but there's other values as well. But I think that's ultimately how I make decisions. And if it fits with my values, I don't worry too much about the decision. And that's worked for me so far.
Okay. Is that do you use the same approach when you think about like risks versus reward?
Yeah. Yeah. What I've learned about myself is that I'm not a big risk taker. And so, for the most part, most of the things that I approach are carefully planned, low risk, of course, by definition, low reward. But again, with the power of compound interest, ultimately big reward.
What do you think separates people who create wealth versus those who chase it? Are there some similarities there?
Well, yes. In fact, I think so. First, let me just step back and kind of give you my definition of wealth because I think it's really an interesting concept. So for me, wealth is obviously much more than it's more than money for sure. Wealth is yes, there are assets that make up wealth. One of them is money, but there are much more important ones that you earn, for example. So in my field, mastery,
Mm.
technical mastery is a form of wealth. Friendships and relationships, family and friends are a form of wealth. Health is a form of wealth. And time is a form of wealth, having discretion over your time. But I think the interesting thing about wealth is unlike those are all also assets we just described. But what makes wealth different than assets is that wealth has a mindset component to it. So for example, if you look at part of wealth as money or possessions, you can buy more possessions and therefore become wealthier, but you can also diminish your wants because really wealth is what you have minus what you want, right? So if you can work on some of your wants, we want a lot of things that we don't need. All of us do. And if you diminish those wants, you increase your wealth. It's like the same thing with wisdom, right? If you diminish your biases, you become wiser without even learning a single fact. So there's a subtraction part of wealth that people overlook, getting rid of pathologic parts of what we want. But I think that I'm guilty, certainly earlier in my career, of chasing wealth because I believe I was so interested in having security. Wealth to me is not about buying things, it's about security. But I overshot what I needed, and it took me a long time to learn the meaning of the word enough, which is a very important word for people to learn. So I do think that chasing wealth is a fool's game.
Mm.
Slowly acquiring it and then utilizing it to make more time for yourself, to make other people's lives better is a really good part of wealth to me.
Man, there were so many things that you said there that I wanted to chime in on and impact. Early on, I too, when I looked at wealth and looked at changing my financial situation, was security, right? Just wanting to be secure, having the experience that I had when I came up, being in a different position with my children and my family, and to make sure I can provide as a man, right? To your point. I did start to realize that time was one of the most precious assets that you can have because you can't you can't get that back, right? You can't recreate that.
Right.
Money you can always recreate. And to your point, I like how you mentioned diminishing your wants increases your wealth, right? Because you're not looking for things. And I look at that when we talk about your net worth, right? Oftentimes you don't need to increase your net worth by making more money, just decrease your expenses and that can increase your net worth. So I love the way that you broke that down. That really resonated with me. I appreciate that. So in this point in your life, you mentioned that, early on, because you were trying to satisfy financial security, you kind of overshot. How do you manage your time, energy, and relationships now?
Well, the first thing that I've come to appreciate, I think, is that experiences are of much greater value than possessions. So that's one thing. I try to say no to a lot of things, except when it comes to experiences. I try to say yes to every experience that's offered me because I recognize that part of life is experiencing things and then creating those memories. And then that becomes the fodder for nostalgia later on, good feelings later on. I'm facing now, I'm in that stage of life where I'm looking at retirement and what that looks like and trying to understand it. But one thing that I've realized is I was focused for a long time on what I was going to do in retirement. And I realized that's the wrong question to ask. For me, the right question to ask is, who am I going to be in retirement? And I hope that person's going to be a friend, a good husband, a good friend, a good family member. And I'm going to use some of the capital that I've acquired over a career, hopefully to make other people's lives better.
That's awesome. That's awesome, man. You're a wise person. We talk a lot here about how people deploy their capital, not just financially, but intellectually, relationship. And I'm curious how that looks for you. At this point in life, what does the word capital mean to you?
Yeah, one thing I got really interested in was this idea of career capital. Capital we talked about before is an asset of sorts. But I think in a career, if you take there's certain steps you can take that really empower you and can be utilized. First and foremost is mastery. So whatever career you're in, just get good at it. It's really simple. Spend a lot of time learning it, getting better, and that has two benefits. One is you'll be better at whatever you do, and number two, it'll create passion in whatever you do. People always think that passion follows, follow your passion, but passion follows mastery. Once you've got the mastery down, and in my field, for example, in medicine, you also have to not just build your technical skill set, but your knowledge, skill set, and also your reputation. But once you have that, a reputation and a skill set and mastery, you have what's called career capital. And what that means is you can use that, you can leverage that. You can decide to work less. You can decide to ask for more money. Or in my case, what you can decide to do is to pivot. And I mentioned earlier, I think, that when you're in that stage of career where you have the career capital, you ask yourself two questions. What do I like and what am I good at? And then you shouldn't be afraid to follow that direction. And so for me, it was a question of diminishing what I did surgically. Also, as you mentioned early on, I started to write books. I became an administrator in the hospital. So I did a whole bunch of stuff that were also enjoyable, that added color to my career. But I could only have done that had I created career capital through first mastery and then reputation and, various skill sets. So I think to me, it's a really important lesson, which is always start by getting really good at something. And then you will have the capacity to pivot if you choose.
I love that. I love that. Wow. So in your career, right? Mastery, sometimes it requires a lot from us. And sometimes that may take us from, family or friends. Did you ever struggle, or how did you manage kind of like that work-life balance?
Yeah, well, certainly struggled. If I could go back in time to when I was starting my career, and if I knew what I know now then, I would have been more aggressive about managing work-life balance rather. And I think that I just I didn't understand the power of compound interest and these atomic habits we talked about earlier. And you don't have to make it all up in the beginning. And I wish that I could have spent more watching my kids grow up a little bit more, being a better family man. Hopefully I'm making up for that now. But I do think the other thing I think that's really important is, it's looking at time life management, or work-life management rather. It feels like a zero-sum game. If you put into one, you have to take away from the other.
Yeah.
But I do think there's another way of looking at it, a kind of a rising tide floats all boats idea, which is that if you are intense in both environments, like at work, you're intense again about learning and getting better, but at life, you're intense about your relationships and etc. You can do a lot to mitigate this whole idea of work-life balance without looking at it as a zero-sum game. Because when people try to cut off the time at work, it ends up both life and work suffer. I think you have to try to make both better as opposed to focusing on taking time away from one for the other.
No, that's a great perspective. And you're right, because I was going to follow up and ask you that, right? When you mentioned that if you could do it all over, you might change some things. And I was going to ask you, do you think you have had the same level of success either at the same time or at the same speed? So that hit home for me when you mentioned most of us look at it as a zero-sum game. And I know that's something that I sometimes struggle with. To your point is when I say, okay, I'm not going to work Fridays, I still catch myself kind of thinking about, oh, I got to do this, so I got to do that, instead of, to your
Right.
point, intense and being intentional about where
Yeah.
I'm at that point in time. And that's something that I'm struggle with and kind of working through. But
That's funny because my dad, when one of the lessons he left me with, I remember him, he said to me, his biggest regret was whenever he was playing, he was worried about work. And whenever he was working, he was fantasizing about playing. And
yeah,
he wished that he had been focused on work when at work and focused on play when at play.
yeah, no, he's wise. That's awesome. So you mentioned that you're transitioning into retirement now, and you mentioned that you were doing some other things because you built up that career capital. Why are you kind of transitioning into retirement now, and what are some things that you're excited about?
Well, I'm excited about doing something new and different. I've been a surgeon for 31 years, but I'm frightened. I'm frightened because, so much of my identity may be tied up in what I've done. And so I have two thoughts that go through my head, and they're almost antithetical to each other. One is, I've already waited too long. Why shouldn't I be enjoying life? And the other one is, don't retire, you fool. You're going to be bored out of your mind. And I don't know how to reconcile those two different ideas. And so what I've done, at least so far as I've gone part-time, I've diminished the hours, and I'm looking to take on some new projects, see if they're exciting to me. I think that looking back at my own career, pivoting has been such an important thing. And each time I've taken on something new, it's been unbelievably rewarding. And I'm hopeful that retirement will be just another pivot where I take on something new that will be rewarding, but that I maintain full discretion of my time. I think that's really important. If I want to go away for 2 weeks, I don't have to worry about doing that. So that's kind of my hope of retirement. I'll
That's
let you
awesome.
know when I get there.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, I think I've read something once or maybe talked to someone I can't remember, and they were saying most of the time when people retire, it's not always good because you're not doing anything. Like the mind isn't active. And maybe it was a professional speaker or someone that they said just try to always stay active with something. And I guess that's why maybe most people take up like hobbies, like usually going fishing and boating to do things. But I don't know. I don't know if I'll get to the point where I want to retire. I may just keep doing it for as long as I can. And to your point, maybe just set up those time barriers where you maybe it's not doing it as much, like you're going to more of a part-time phase
Yeah.
or keep doing things.
I don't know that it's so much being active, because that won't be a problem for me, but it's having meaning. I think more than being active, that what you do has meaning to you is really important. Most people worry about running out of money in retirement.
Mm,
I worry about running out of meaning in retirement,
interesting.
which is
Interesting.
probably a lot more of a problem.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Nah, you hit the nose in the coffin. So you talked about your legacy. I mean, you talked about really having meaning and making an impact. What do you hope people say about the impact you've made one day?
Um, that's a great question. Um, I hope people think that I contributed something. The practice that I built, which is, a 10-man neurosurgical group, was a positive thing for medicine. I hope that my family and friends will say that I was there for them, that I added to the value of their lives. It's interesting. I don't know if you've read anything by David Brooks, but he makes this distinction between your resume and your eulogy. And when you're young, you're working to build your resume, but when you get older, you're really working to build your eulogy, what they say about you when you die. And so that's where I'm focused now. But I think a lot of it has to do with just being a good friend, husband, person, etc.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome.
Father.
Yeah. What's one lesson about money or life that you want to pass on to your children if you haven't done it already?
That money is, even though I sought it as a part of security, as we talked about before, money is really a means, not an end. And the power of money there is some power of money in terms of affecting change. But what people think, they've done this study, no matter what you make, people believe if they made whatever, 10% more, 20% more, they'd be happy. Money is never a path to happiness. Happiness is, first, there is no proven path to happiness. One of the things I got interested in was the movement of positive psychology that came out of University of Pennsylvania. Happiness is not what you should be pursuing. They use the term flourishing. You want to flourish. By flourishing, that means that you're sometimes miserable because you're working really hard, but that means putting time into relationships, being mindful, living in the present, working for something, uh, that requires delayed gratification. Those are all part of flourishing. The analogy I like to use is, imagine yourself climbing Mount Everest and keeping a diary. Each moment that you're climbing, your diary entries are things like, this sucks, I can't breathe, I'm exhausted, I'm freezing. But after you climb it, what do you say about it? Greatest thing I ever did.
Mm,
There's a big difference between day in and day out turmoil that you deal with and how you frame it ultimately.
mm,
How you frame things ultimately is money gets you from point A to point B. but it has nothing to do with how you frame your life ultimately, which is what flourishing is.
Pat, I'm taking this last snippet that you just eloquently communicated, and I'm going to put that in so many type of inspirational posts. So thank you for sharing that, Jen. I like that. The diary of climbing Mount Everest, because that's exactly how it is. And I wanted to touch on something quickly too. You mentioned the psychology movement that came out of the University of Pennsylvania. I want to dig into that more at a later time because I'm interested in that. But I'm real big on law of attraction movement, right? Positivity. And one of the theories or one of the tactics or the strategies they use, going back to what you mentioned earlier, is that happiness doesn't come from external things, right? You have to internally cultivate that feeling of happiness or flourishing or gratitude for it to eventually show up in your experience, right? So I've spent a lot of my work working internally to be that person, right? They say you be that person before you can attract it. And to your point, right? I've noticed, right, that, I'm financially independent now, right? And I'm different than how I was 5, 10 years ago, but I'm no happier than I was before, right? I'm happier because I cultivate it internally, right? It's not an extension of that. And Warren Buffett also mentioned one time that, I'm a billionaire and most of you guys haven't had that type of money, but I still have to get up out the bed like you all do, right? I drive a car to and from work like you all do, but the only real difference between me and what you guys would do are the experiences that I can have, right? So that really hit home. We're coming on the tail end, Pat. This was awesome. I just wanted to do a rapid round of 4 or 5 questions, and I want you to just spit out the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask you. What?
Okay.
Cool. All
You
right, cool,
got it.
cool. Book that changed your life.
So Good They Can't Ignore You by, blanking on the author, but So Good They Can't Ignore You.
I like that. Best investment under $500.
One of those machines in my basement where you can do dips and pull-ups.
Ooh, I like it. I did dips and pull-ups the other day. One word that defines success.
Flourish.
Who do you admire for how they deploy capital?
My father.
I like it. I like it. Pat, this was amazing. Thank you again for being a guest on the show Deployed. For everyone listening, we appreciate you guys for tuning in again, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.